The Final Fantasy series is a monolith and one of the founders of the RPG genre, providing a breakthrough title for Squaresoft back in 1987, and it's a series that would go on to define and build some of the most impressive worlds and stories that we've seen in video games. There has been a philosophy and an approach that has been taken with the Final Fantasy series where each new entry would push the series forward in terms of what the genre had to offer, and provide new thrilling experiences and worlds for us to get lost in. What we would see is a golden age in the 90s for Square would slowly shift into an era of growing pains and directional challenges for the series in the mid to late 2000s, where we would see projects reworked, delayed, or envisioned in a different way than they were originally intended. MMOs crash and resurrect to critical acclaim and wild amounts of success. And in many ways, this is Final Fantasy in a nutshell. It is an ambitious series that is always trying to push the envelope of what the genre can be and always trying to move it forward and make new, ambitious, and creative experiences. And that's something that can be said for all the most recent mainline entries of Final Fantasy. They've been two things: ambitious and contentious, where many of these games have been ambitious in what they try to achieve but have fumbled in their execution. So now here we are with the latest mainline entry, Final Fantasy XVI, and many of us wonder, is this game good? Is it repeating many of the mistakes of previous games? And what new ambitious direction is this latest entry pushing and taking us towards? Well, that's what we're going to answer in this review and cover. But first, we're going to just go over a few things that I find important before actually tackling the game. So, first and foremost, it is important to keep in mind when heading into Final Fantasy XVI that this is in fact a bold new direction in many ways for the series, and it nails many aspects of that experience. The narrative, whilst being influenced by more Western fantasy, like Game of Thrones, sustains much of its fantastical nature and grandiose environments, cities, and history that you would find in a Final Fantasy game. On the flip side to this, I do feel that there is an overcorrection and downright removal of many of the gameplay aspects and RPG elements that define and make that Final Fantasy experience whole, that makes this feel at times like a completely different game entirely. These changes are not just through the shift from turn-based or active time combat to action combat, that's fine. It's more through the linear corridors and the approach to exploration, that shallow one-dimensional progression systems, and the lack of many meaningful side quests that can make this experience feel a lot less like a Final Fantasy game in spirit. It's an enjoyable experience overall, and it kept me engaged throughout the 45 hours that I've played both the main and side content. And it's definitely a title that I'm glad to have experienced, and overall I do think that Final Fantasy XVI is a great experience, but this is just something to keep in mind before I dive into the nitty-gritty. It may be a divisive game for you. If you are looking for an RPG, this may not be one that lands for you. But if you're here looking for just a good time and a good story, and you're happy and down for a good action game, this may be up your alley. And I do think that Clive's journey in of itself is one worth seeing through to the end, but if you are looking for a particular type of video game with a particular genre in mind, that being an RPG, then this one might be a miss for you. So before we do get into the gameplay, I'm going to dive into the story and discussing the story a bit more now. So with that in mind, I'm going to be discussing story elements from the prologue and giving a general gist of things and how I felt. So if you want to go in completely blind, maybe skip this section and come back once you finish the game. But now we're going to dive into the story for Final Fantasy XVI. The story for Final Fantasy XVI takes place in the world of Valisthea, which is divided into two continents of Ash and Storm. These continents are inhabited by these magical crystals, referred to as the Mother Crystals, which provide Aether, the magical energy that fuels and drives many of these civilizations. There are two different types of people living within Valisthea, those who are able to use magic and those who cannot. These magic users are referred to as bearers, and in this world, bearers are branded literally and figuratively as tools and slaves to the non-bearers. A broader thread that drives much of the conflict throughout Valisthea is this overusage of the Mother Crystals and Ether energy, which is succumbing to a plague known as the Blight, which thrusts many of these different nations into war with one another for land, power, and ether. Each nation is weaponized with their own unique tool and super weapon that is known as a dominant, which are chosen individuals who are able to use the magic of the Mother Crystals without the actual crystal, and able to transform into this godly summon that you are probably familiar with if you've played previous Final Fantasy games that are tied usually to a certain element. The story follows Clive Rosefield, the son of Elwyn Rosefield, the king of House Rosaria. Sworn in as a shield of his brother Joshua, who is the dominant of the Phoenix, Clive is devoted to protect his brother. However, after witnessing the death of his brother, Clive is thrusted into a world of chasing his brother's killer and finding justice and seeking revenge. The story will take place in many different time periods of Clive's life, that being of 16, 27, and 32. So the story will jump between different parts, and if you've played the demo and the prologue, you would have seen that part of the story where he was 16. So that really does set everything in motion, and that prologue really does establish a lot of the foundations and building blocks of the world, and then later on in the story they only iterate and further flesh it out. But thankfully, if you are ever stuck on information or jargon that is related to the story, such as like what is a dominant for example, there is a really neat feature that is baked into the game that you can use during a cutscene or just randomly when you're exploring the world, which we'll dive into a bit shortly. But the game always makes good effort at trying to keep you in the loop as to what is happening and going on within the game, and makes sure that it's fleshing out the world and providing enough context to a lot of the grand story that it's trying to build towards. But one thing that I think really does make Final Fantasy great is Clive's journey and the companions that he meets along the way, and how they shape and shift the journey as well as guide him, and how that wraps up and entangles with the conclusion of the story so well. And it makes a lot of the themes that are running throughout the story feel so much more satisfying when the story comes to its big grand finale. And I think a lot of these characters really are a great inclusion and have a great relationship with Clive, and overall are just very memorable and interesting here. The story for Final Fantasy XVI is easily one of the high points of this game, and a lot of the characters that you meet throughout the journey are quite memorable. And this is one aspect that I think if you don't click with its gameplay, its story will be the big thing that hinges on your enjoyment. And I think it's very easy to get invested in this story with a really strong first half that is so easy to captivate and throw you into the story. I think that it is quite clear here that Final Fantasy XVI has taken a lot of influence from many different areas, where it feels like an amalgamation of the political conflicts of Game of Thrones married together with the colossal brawling monsters that you would see in something like Attack on Titan. Whilst I mentioned that it does still have a lot of narrative influences in a world and setup and the form of storytelling, that it sustains much of that Final Fantasy feeling whilst borrowing forms of influence from other areas and going with a much more darker tone. This isn't just like a Game of Thrones knockoff or something. Whilst it does have that political intrigue and a very Western influence, it very much still does feel like a Final Fantasy game and has a lot of its own original ideas baked into its story. And I'm grateful for that because it is a great story overall, and I do feel that a lot of these elements here in this darker setting really is a great direction for Final Fantasy to explore. Whilst I enjoy many of the other games, this is one aspect of a new game that I'm glad they're taking a direction with. However, there is one thing that is really worthy of mention here, and that is how, unlike many other Final Fantasy games, this one is a lot more centered around its protagonist. This game is very much focused around Clive's journey, and this game's enjoyment will be very dependent on how much you actually click with Clive. I do feel that Clive as a character is a very likable and admirable character that is very easy to connect with, but if you, for whatever reason, don't gel with Clive, I feel it'll be very hard to get invested in a lot of the aspects of this story. Whereas, let's say you played another Final Fantasy game, like let's say you didn't like Tidus, there is a lot of other characters in 10 that you could click with, like Auron, Wakka, Yuna, that you could get invested in. Or likewise with, 7. If you didn't like Cloud for whatever reason you wouldn't like Cloud, there's a lot of other good characters there, like Cid, Tifa, Aeris, there's plenty of characters to really dive into. But here, there's a lot of supporting characters, but these characters feel more like characters that pop in and out of Clive's life than party members that are along for the whole journey. And that leads me to my next point. One criticism that I've seen levied at Final Fantasy XVI is that lack of emphasis on a party, and the connection that the previous games have established through having a party member and cast to connect with, and as you, the main character, can be a link to many of these side characters in their own story. Whilst I do feel there is some validity to those criticisms, I do believe that the approach that Final Fantasy XVI does take here works in a lot of different ways and through a different lens, that the companions in 16 are more these people that drop into Clive's life and are represented and a representation of that moment in Clive's life. So you could be adventuring with Jill or adventuring with Cid, or even out on a quest with Gav or many other characters that will pop into the story without spoiling anything. And it really does show different aspects of Clive's life and how these characters have an influence on Clive as a character and how they make him grow and think differently and influence many of the choices he made in his life. And I think that overall, when you see this this game to its finale, a lot of it will make sense and it'll actually feel understandable. We do get insights into these characters' hardships, regrets, and goals, but not as party members, but more as supporting characters that kind of give an impact and reflection onto Clive. Their goals and aspirations and ambitions manifest within him, they reflect into him, and as well as themselves, they all have their own journey and they're all fighting for something, but instead of weakening him, they do strengthen him. And like I mentioned earlier, this game is mainly centered around him and he carries a lot of their feelings with him, and that is one thing that is explored throughout this story. Whilst we don't get proper side quests to flesh these characters out more extensively, which I do think would have helped, I do believe that they do build a strong cause and case for a lot of these characters throughout the narrative. It is a major shift and change from prior entries, I get that. That is something you may love or hate, but personally I think it's great that they took this chance with this game to do something different and try to take a different approach. And I think with the themes of this game and its overall dark tone and the way that all the conflict kind of progresses, it does make a lot more sense that more people kind of pop in and out of Clive's life throughout this journey, and I do think that it does provide an interesting different way of doing that type of party member storytelling. Whilst it's not perfect, it is an interesting starting block and building block that they could explore in future entries and refine in different ways. I do think that an absence of like side quests that are specifically tailored to characters, like something like similar to Mass Effect, I know they're very different games, but something where you can explore characters individually and go on their own journey, something like that would be welcomed in a game like this. But I do think there's plenty of ways they could make this type of stuff work, and I still do think that once I finished the game, I did find a lot of the supporting cast still fairly memorable. I don't know, let me know what you guys think about that in the comments, but if there is one area of Final Fantasy XVI that they succeed in and that I was really hooked into and enjoyed throughout the whole experience, it was the story. The main story was great. There was only really one thing that I took issue with, and that was how they kind of tacked in these like little side quests into the main quest at different parts. And that kind of did feel like it would give aspects of this story and different parts of the game a stop and start feeling, where you'd be going from high octane action to like the next moment just doing a little busy work before going back into the main story. And that was just like one little thing that kind of threw me off at like 2 or 3 different parts in the story. But overall, this experience and this part of the game is just great. It's definitely one part of the game that is worth experiencing in my opinion. And overall, I think that this story doesn't disappoint. It is a little convoluted at times, but no more than any other Final Fantasy game. And I think that if you are looking for that RPG kind of narrative and a Final Fantasy narrative, that this is here, albeit a little different, but it's there. One excellent new addition to Final Fantasy XVI is the inclusion of this feature called the Active Time Lore system. And the way that this system works is you can hold down the touchpad at any given point, whether you're playing the game or even watching a cutscene, and it will pull up many relevant pieces of information, sort of like an encyclopedia, for you to reference many different characters, locations, and even like terms that are familiar with the world of Valisthea and Clive's journey. It's super useful as there's a lot of moving parts that play out throughout your 40-hour adventure, and you may forget 1 or 2 things, and this is always constantly updating in real time, so any new information that is documented about a character or that has transpired in the story will be in this active time lore. So when you have free time, you can go and visit a certain character and they'll give you the whole big picture of everything that you want to look up, but this active time lore system will give you the more tailored information that you need at a given point in time for what is transpiring in front of you. I really do think that this is a great system, as it helps fill in any blanks if you take a break from the game for a week and you come back and you're like, what's going on again? Or you're someone who's just missed a particular cutscene, or, you know, zoned out for a second and missed an important piece of information, that there's a lot of stuff there to help you piece things together and never fall behind in the story. And it also helps provide a lot of information to help build and flesh out the overarching story of Final Fantasy XVI and get a good grasp on what is going on, as a lot of things do happen and unfold. Overall, I think that going forward, this is definitely one feature that Final Fantasy games should always have, and many big sprawling RPG games that are like fleshing out a broader world and stories in general that just have a big story that they're going for with, like, you know, 30 plus hours should have some sort of system like this where you can look up information in real time and it's always updating in real time, because truly this is something that helps keep the story fresh and keep you engaged in what's going on. One of the biggest departures that is taken with Final Fantasy XVI is its approach to combat. Ever since Final Fantasy XII, the series has been moving towards more methods and systems to make the game's combat feel more active and action-like. Here in Final Fantasy XVI, it is a clear-cut change in terms of combat. Where I'd say Final Fantasy XV felt more like Kingdom Hearts, I would say Final Fantasy XVI feels more like Devil May Cry. The reason why it would feel this way is due to Final Fantasy XV's combat director being Ryuta Suzuki, who worked at Capcom on many huge titles such as Devil May Cry 4 and 5 alongside Dragon's Dogma and Marvel vs. Capcom 2. It is important here because the approach to gameplay in Final Fantasy XVI provides a hefty amount of its focus on the moment-to-moment combat and action rather than the strategy, planning, status effects, elemental effects, and other mechanisms that occupy a more traditional Final Fantasy experience. Instead, the combat here is more focused on utilizing your various Eikon abilities that you acquire throughout various parts of the story, and also utilizing your trusty hound Torgal. The standard enemies can be approached in many different ways and are easy enough to dispatch, but where the combat may get a bit more diverse and interesting is when they introduce the will bar, which is a yellow bar that appears under the enemy's health bar. Once you empty the enemy's will bar, you will stagger them, meaning that you are able to deal extra damage and unload all of your abilities onto this enemy before they get back up. In these encounters, you'll be dancing and juggling your abilities, choosing when to prioritize staggering abilities and damage-based abilities. Then, on top of that, there will be commanding Torgal, where he has 3 separate commands. One that is called Sick, which dispatches Torgal onto the current enemy that Clive is attacking. The second ability is called Heal, which obviously heals you. The final ability is called Ravage, which will knock the enemy up into the air if possible, meaning that you can continue or set up combos as Clive, and it is a good opener or finisher or continuation for many different combos. These abilities, while simple, do provide a good contribution to the potential to stagger and also open up combat and combos for different enemies, pushing the limits of your moveset. Speaking of the moveset, here in Final Fantasy XV's combat, I would say that it's definitely accessible even without the easy mode rings that simplify combat. You'll be able to approach this game as a newcomer or as a turn-based player and be able to grasp the combat fairly easily. The combat is simple, but with that being said, it isn't shallow. It may not have that level of combos and movesets that you're used to in a game like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, but it does make up for it with this variation of abilities that you can channel through your icons and finding ways to combo, juggle, and mince up as many enemies as possible and do it with style. I have seen many push the boundaries of combat and this combat model, and whilst it is impressive to see someone who knows what they are doing pull off some crazy combos, I do still wonder just how far you can push the limits of this system. An interesting little side note is one combat system that Final Fantasy XVI does feel somewhat familiar to and adjacent to is a game like Tales of Arise, where you provide a set of abilities and teammates to call in for support and attack. Tales of Arise offers an action-based real-time system where you are pulling off a bunch of moves that you've ascribed to your character, much like Final Fantasy. However, in Tales, it's a bit different. Despite Tales being action-based, such as Final Fantasy XVI, it still feels mechanically oriented around RPG elements, where I would argue Final Fantasy XVI feels like an action combat system that fully focuses and leans into the action elements more than those RPG elements, where it feels like much of the RPG mechanics of Final Fantasy XVI carry no real weight in battle. By the way, this isn't me saying, wow, they should have done what Tales did, but more to show a contrast between two similar systems of action-oriented JRPGs and where both of these games kind of diverge and tend to put their focus. Where Tales is emphasized on still building your character, tailoring your skills to match a certain class or style of play, and like overall having a party of, healers, tanks, and attack-based different movesets and characters and different spells to kind of tailor yourself to play that style. Final Fantasy XVI feels like you can customize your abilities and they're all focused around a more hack and slash system that operates on two different dances of staggering and attacking. Final Fantasy XV's central combat hinges more on its abilities and mechanical knowledge rather than RPG elements. The real question to be asked here is how much depth does Final Fantasy XVI have to offer in terms of mechanical depth, when compared to the games that have influenced its combat model and also its other contemporaries. I think only time will tell on that department, as I do see a lot of people right now pushing the boundaries and saying there is depth to this mechanics system, but I do wonder when I look at a lot of other games, particularly ones that have influenced this game, and other games that are currently out and, available to play right now. When I think of like your Devil May Cry's, your Bayonettas, even your Ninja Gaidens and games of that nature, I just think, how does a game like Final Fantasy XVI stack up? Because it is more adjacent to these games than it is to a JRPG, and that is the kind of weight division that it is punching in. Overall, did I enjoy the combat in Final Fantasy XVI? Yeah, for the most part, I think it was pretty fun and fresh for that 40 hours. Do I think it had a crazy level of depth? I do think there is a good layer of depth that does keep you engaged for most of that 40 hours. However, I do question a lot of things around this combat model and how fresh and how long it will remain fresh. How much levels of depth there can be in terms of being able to master this system. Because with a lot of other games, when we think of other hack and slash games like your Bayonettas, your Devil May Cry's as your two golden standards to go to for this, once you finish this game, you can go to a new mode called Final Fantasy mode, and it's meant to be like a hard mode, but it's not necessarily that much more challenging, and it really just introduces some features like, introducing level 100 and a few other things in that realm. But the real question I have is, when you look at games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, their loop to keep you in the game and invested is unlocking more abilities and playing on a harder difficulty to master that skill set. Here in Final Fantasy XVI, I really do question how much of that skill set there really is to master and how long it'll take people to really have a strong grasp on that and reach the ceiling that is being masterful at this game. I think that Devil May Cry and Bayonetta also, through their progression loops of having to play these games on harder difficulties and introducing more and more abilities that you can't unlock everything through one playthrough, makes multiple playthroughs and higher difficulties give more of a challenge that can give people a higher reward, a bigger and greater sense of style and skill when pulling off those crazy combos. So the big question for me is, well, long term, how much is there to the Final Fantasy XVI skill set of its hack and slash, melee, action combat, whatever you want to call it, versus those RPG elements? Because let's be real, that RPG side of this combat and things that would have kept that aspect of Final Fantasy in the past engaging for the long term aren't really here in this game, and it is more riding on its action combat model. And I would really like to see in a year from now how people feel about this combat system, because overall I think it is great for one playthrough, but coming back to it and playing it over and over again like you would a DMC game, I have to wonder at what point does it really start to get stale and how long does it remain fresh for. And to close this off, I just want to be clear, I do like this system and I did have fun with it. I do think overall that it is fun, but I do think in terms of replayability, which we'll discuss later, how much is there really to offer here in the long term? There's a reason why I can go back and I can replay Final Fantasy VII, or hell, even play a Persona game 3 times now, where they're 100-hour experiences, and just go back and keep playing them. And whilst I love many aspects of Final Fantasy XVI, I wonder to myself, will I want to go back and play this game in a year or two from now, or is one playthrough and the memories that I've gained now really enough? And that's the question that I have, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this down below, but I guess each to their own and only time will tell. So, in Final Fantasy XVI, if there is one thing that they have not held back on, it is the sheer, incredible amount of spectacle and high-octane action that is expressed through the Eikon Battles. These moments truly are a high point and provide you the ability to fight as an Eikon and provide a different form of combat to the standard combat that we just discussed. So the combat and movesets are fairly limited in terms of what you can do. There is some stuff there, and you do get new abilities that you acquire throughout the story, but overall I would say the combat itself is kind of taking a backseat to more the sheer spectacle and what you can do and how crazy these segments are. What is to be had in these moments is just the sheer bombastic balls to the wall spectacle that is reminiscent of an action game like Asura's Wrath. Honestly, some of these moments are just some incredible, unbelievable spectacle and action, and I know I'm just repeating those words, and despite this restrictive amount of moves that you can do, it does provide an overall enjoyable enjoyable experience just to how chaotic the level of destruction and back and forth between each icon is that transpires. It feels like each moment in the story is kind of leading up to this grand arc here, and it's like a DBZ fight, but you don't have those 20 episodes of powering up each time you step into an Eikon battle. It's just boom, straight in, go hard or go home, and it just ups the ante every single time, more and more as you progress through the story. And it honestly is some eye-melting stuff. The more you see, the more you're just like, whoa, did I just witness that? And the visuals, the music, all of these choices, and the narrative impact that they have just make these moments just feel like some euphoric high. And honestly, these are some of the most memorable experiences of Final Fantasy XVI and are something that I feel like most people are going to remember when thinking back on this game. I think whether you love or hate this game, you can acknowledge that these moments are so incredible, and they are like legit just they are so intense that they will cause your PlayStation to legit heat up. Okay, I know that's not a good thing, but these segments are actually just next level crazy, and they are something that I feel Final Fantasy XVI really nails, and they handle it so tactfully with their story, and then they make these moments feel so great in how they function and play. Despite the mechanics of these moments when you handle the icons maybe not being the most technical or crazy, overall I do think that they are something that is more memorable, and they feel like something that I would see in a 2010 game where the days of like attitude and just over the top and bombastic combat, like your Metal Gear Revengeance and things of that nature. So I mean that in a positive way, and I think Eikon Battles are truly just something to behold, and I will hold back on that and say no more because I want you to experience that element of the game for yourself. So now that we've talked about the two major forms of combat in Final Fantasy XVI, I want to hone in more on the gameplay systems here, starting off with the progression in Final Fantasy XVI. So first and foremost, let's discuss the ability system, which is much more pulled back than many other Final Fantasy systems you'd be used to. This approach is understandable given the nature of Final Fantasy XVI's combat, and every unlockable ability that is attached to an Eikon's skill tree here has some use in combat. I actually do quite like this type of model and approach to the ability system, and feel that it works quite well given the type of combat model Final Fantasy XVI is going for. So to expand upon this, I'll first give an overview of how the ability system works in conjunction with combat. So you are able to equip 3 various icons that you unlock throughout the game, which will come with 2 abilities that can be modified and swapped around and binded to the square and triangle button when pressing the R2 button. There are also static icon abilities that are bounded to the circle button, which can't be changed but are a part of a particular icon's skill set. These are often abilities that provide utility, such as timed parries, dashing to an enemy, or pulling an enemy towards you, just to name a few. They are all quite useful and have their place in combat, and there are many different setups and connectors for many of your combos that will ride on these different utility abilities that are a part of that icon's skill set that you can weave between your basic attacks and other abilities once they come off cooldown. As you progress through the game, you'll be able to learn new abilities within a particular tree. So this means that you are able to have that icon equipped, but you can also alternate between many different icon abilities affiliated within that icon tree. So you will get about 5 abilities for, let's say, Garuda, but you can only really equip 2 at a time. But learning an ability will mean that you can shift between different sets of that, like set of 5, and you can modify and pick which 2 abilities within that tree you want to use. Then there is also the approach called mastery, when after learning ability you can then spend more points to master it, which means you are able to, let's say you're using the Titan icon, equip the tornado ability from the Garuda icon and have that in your Titan skill tree if you don't want to use Garuda. So you can have 2 different abilities from 2 different icons mixed and matched within one icon if you've mastered that ability. And it is in this type of area where you can start to really mix and match and modify to your liking and get a moveset that really fits the type of playstyle that you are going for. It's a great method for introducing experimentation with the moveset, and early on in the game I did find myself mixing and matching and playing around with a lot of different tools that have been provided. Once you do find your footing and the movesets that work, it can feel a little hard to want to continue to experiment, given how sparse you do get new icon abilities and how comfortable you kind of feel with the ones that you're already using. However, you do like to mix and match and modify, and the more and more you go on, and once you do find your groove, you do find new abilities that you can chuck in and, mix and play around with. But overall, I do feel like there is a type of comfortable skill set that you get used to, and there's other different icons that kind of feel more useful than others, but I do think that none of them are particularly bad. They all are good. It just depends on how you like to play and what you like to use that works. But I do think overall that is one big element that will ride or die on how much you enjoy the game, is how much you're able to mix and match and find different abilities that will work well together. And overall, I do feel like this progression system in a lot of ways is a ton of fun. And it is one aspect, given the type of game that they're going for with action-based combat, I do think this is one area of the game that I think actually lands and is the one form of progression that is in this game that I think does work. I do think that it does take a bit of time to really get the momentum going and really get into the system, but once it clicks, it does click and it is pretty fun to use, and therefore makes combat a lot more fun and bearable throughout the long runtime.
Good decision.
Unfortunately, in terms of progression, that is the only aspect that I feel really clicks into place and actually works well for Final Fantasy XVI, as I feel much of the weakest aspects of the Final Fantasy XVI experience are just how watered down the approach to gear progression is, and how absent any meaningful progressions for equipping new pieces of equipment is to the experience, and just the types of benefits and boons that it provides you, like just being minor stat increases. Again, I'd like to reiterate that Final Fantasy XVI is a great action game, but is a shallow RPG, and it is evident given the focus in combat being more centered around the aspects of combos, timing, and utilizing abilities, rather than strategy, character building, or upgrading in ways that can elevate the combat experience. What do I mean by this? Well, there are multiple different things that they could have introduced in this aspect of the game, whether it is a particular weapon providing special abilities, different elemental effects to weapons, or necklaces or accessories that could protect you, or other buffs or spells when equipped. Like, think about this. Imagine if there was two separate swords, one that could kind of do like an uppercut ability and one that could do a whirlwind or something like that. These could be like combos or, particular like abilities that are tied to the sword, or elemental effects being tied to the sword, having like an ice sword, a fire sword, or things like this, and having them correlate to the type of things you attack, and having things that you would normally see in a Final Fantasy game carry over to the combat here in 16. And whilst I do think the combat is pretty cool and action-focused spectacle works really well, I do think that there could have been other things here that would have just put it a notch above other different games and kind of given it its own unique flair. And when I say things like accessories or necklaces that could provide different effects, I think of the things that are traditionally in Final Fantasy. Like, you look at some of the enemies you find in this game and they cast Protect, which is like a shield and a shell that kind of protects the enemy from dealing damage. Imagine wearing a necklace that every minute could proc and, give you a shell like the Protect spell for about, 5 seconds or something like that. It'd just be really cool if they had these different things, and I get that, there's probably reasons why they didn't go for this, and they've probably playtested or done something to kind of see why that didn't work, but I just think like there's a lot of things that they could have done to kind of meld those RPG elements and a lot of things like that into this combat here, and, not only that, have it correlate and make progression and things that you get throughout the game feel more meaningful. But here in 16, unfortunately, a lot of these things are just number increases. And it's to the point where I just feel like you could just remove this equipment entirely, give Clive one iconic sword, have him use that throughout the whole game, and when you level up, just give a few extra numbers to the health increase, to the damage increase, and your like other stats for defense and things of that nature, and it probably wouldn't have really impacted your experience too much. The only real things that would have some impact are the necklaces and accessories that you equip that, require different cooldowns and say, oh, this ability goes down a bit quicker and things of that nature, which they are alright and they're not too bad, but they're still pretty on the weak and watered down side of what I would expect from an RPG, especially something as renowned as Final Fantasy. But again, this is what I mean when I say there's different expectations you should have when going into this game, and you should be kind of open to this being a particular sort of experience. If you're going to go in and expect an RPG here, you are going to be disappointed. But I think there is some room for worthy criticism, because this game, in both its length, its systems, is putting itself on display as a RPG. And if you look at it from that angle and want to play it that way, I do think that there is a shallow experience there to be had. But on the flip side, I think if you go into this purely just expecting an action game with some good solid combat, this will work really well in tandem with how the main story plays out, and you will have a good time. I overall think there is a lot of good stuff to be had here in Final Fantasy XVI, but the weakest element just falls on how the progression feels in this system, and it really is one of the big major aspects that I think drags and pulls down the combat in some respects, as there is only so much that the ability tree system and the basic combat and movesets can really offer. And I feel like had this approach to progression been handled properly, I do think that there would have been a lot more staying power in its combat and systems, and I do think that this game's longevity and replay value would have been extended drastically. But overall, I still do think that the combat does hold its own, but it is being pulled down by this aspect of the game. Overall, the progression in Final Fantasy is ultimately, to me, the weakest aspect, and overall my experience in every subsequent RPG aspect of this game really just suffers from just how underwhelming the rewards and progression systems are. One of the more interesting systems that I find in Final Fantasy XVI is the inclusion of a system called the Renown System. And how this works is that you complete various activities such as side quests and hunts, and you are rewarded with renown. I think of this like an honor system. The way that the renown system works is that you acquire more renown and you reach new milestones, rewarding you with items and materials. It's basically meant to be this kind of notion that, Clive's good deeds give him and net him, more notoriety as well as new resources to help towards his cause. It's a good idea on paper and probably one of the better progression systems that is baked into Final Fantasy XVI. However, there are a few different problems that stem from other systems, and this Renown system has two major issues to me, or two major things that I'd like to point out. One is mainly an issue and the other is a nice to have. The primary issue is that the rewards and again overall progression for completing these quests are really lackluster. Like, you will complete Final Fantasy's quests and be rewarded with materials. You'll reach a renown milestone and be rewarded with materials. Or even, on the rare occasion a necklace which can actually do something like, a ring or something that can kind of benefit you in some way with a little buff. But most of these are just materials to craft weapons, which, as I mentioned earlier, aren't very fulfilling. They are just minor stat increases. So again, these issues with gear progression feed and seep into pulling down the renown system as well. Many of the progression issues here are just watered down and borderline non-existent. And I think had the Renown system, given Clive different armor set or, different sword or something, or even just a cosmetic little outfit or something, to just show that what you're doing, and completing the Renown quests actually has these little benefits, it would have been quite cool. And I think there is a lot that they could have done with that. And I get that the system they have, there's only so much they can do, but I just feel like this, again, just stems from the bones of how watered down the gear progression is. Another aspect of the Renown system that I do feel in some ways is a missed opportunity is through having the action of your good deeds kind of blossom in the open world itself. Completing various quests and having some representation or footprint within the world of your good deeds. A really good example that I can think of when I point to this is the Xenoblade series. There's many different major cities like there are in Final Fantasy XVI, but in Xenoblade you have that whole affinity system where you can strengthen relationships with many different residents of those towns, and you can see your actions come to life and, helping these different people blossom and build these cities up in their time of crisis. And it feels like you're really helping this world thrive and rebuild and making a difference. Here in Final Fantasy XVI, it just feels like you do a little bit of busy work for people. It doesn't really feel like your actions shine through in any way or like you have an influence on the world. And this Renown system would have been a really great way to show that through its side systems and sub-content. And I just think going forward, I do think, if they go down this route again, the Renown system is definitely worth keeping, but I just wish that they could tailor and fully utilize this cool idea that they have to make your influence in the world feel more realized. Because thinking about it, the Renown system in its name is how the legend of Clive is looked upon, but it barely is ever executed within the world and is barely ever really given any substance or time to shine. And I think that is the biggest shame here. So next we're going to move on now to the exploration and side activities that you can actually do in Final Fantasy XVI. So you'll be able to explore many different locations of Valisthea. These locations in their design and presentation look quite nice to traverse through, and have some really nice vistas to look at that are off in the distance. The amount of visual design and work that went into this game, and the areas and the worlds, just how they pop to life, and the different color palettes used to make these places, their biomes, and overall just the music to match and accompany these areas is just phenomenal, and it's great, and it really is something that I would say is really nice and brings Valisthea to life. Valisthea, period, is just an incredible world to get lost in. The problem begins to take form when you are thrown into these open areas. These are meant to operate as semi-open world areas where you can explore, complete quests, and fight some dangerous foes. However, this whole system begins to fall apart once you begin to recognize the corridor-like approach to these open areas, with no real diverging paths, no caves to explore or side areas to investigate. Every little town there is something that is at some point you're going to explore throughout the story, in most cases. There's not even the basic enemy camps that you would come to know in open world games. There is very few and far in between of things to actually do, and it makes this world feel very vacant. And it's great to do the combat, it is great to go and run through a beautiful world, but without meaningful reason for doing a lot of these things, it really does hinder that aspect of the game. Traversing many of these open areas is honestly a flashback to the corridor-like levels of Final Fantasy XIII. If you are looking for a more expansive open world experience here, or locations and activities or anything like that that really populate and flesh out this world and make each different area of Valisthea feel really meaningful, unfortunately, they are sparse to non-existent. Everything that occupies this world are just standard enemies, special marked enemies from the hunts, and normally there's just other things that are there that take host to a side quest in most cases, and we'll get to side quests later, trust me. Outside of this, there is really nothing else to do here in terms of exploration. And that is a real shame, as these environments, locations, and the world itself, is just incredible. Even the enemies that populate the world that you do see, the monsters and stuff, they are quite nice, and everything here just makes you want to do something. It's just the problem is, the game rarely ever gives you something to actually do outside of those, side quests and these hunts. And it's good to have those two activities, but the word exploration means coming out and discovering things, and there is unfortunately very little here to discover. And this approach to exploration alongside the progression really do weaken this game's overall loop outside of the fun factor of its combat and its main story. Final Fantasy XVI will see the return of hunts, which will see you setting out into these open world areas that we just discussed, and searching for rare creatures and enemies that have a bounty. These hunts are actually quite fun, as they require you to read the bulletin board and gather information of where your target has been sighted. But they don't just map marker out where the enemy is, they make you go on an adventure out to that area and sleuth out where the exact location of these enemies are. It is one aspect of Final Fantasy XVI's exploration that I do think the game handles very well, and I feel like had they added more content like this into the game and padded it out better, it would have actually made the exploration quite fun. These hunts are actually so engaging and so good, it just feels like it is always great when you see new bounties on the bulletin board and you just go and look and you can read through different, locations and hints as to where this enemy will be, and they also have different tiers, meaning that they vary in difficulty. So they're always a nice little aside when you're not wanting to do side quests or the main story. Many of the enemies that you face here are not pushovers either, requiring you to at least be semi-proficient and familiar with how your moves and abilities work, making it a fun side challenge whenever you do encounter one of these targets. The rewards for these hunts, much like in every other aspect of this game, ultimately do hinge on those progression systems, and I'm not going to beat a dead horse here, but you will be rewarded with XP, gil, and materials, much like many of the other systems that I mentioned before. So that brings me to the third major component to the exploration of Final Fantasy XVI, and that's the game's side quests. Side quests in Final Fantasy XVI are divided into two subcategories, where one is just a normal regular side quest and the other one is like marked with a plus sign, meaning it has more progression and importance, providing new weapons from the blacksmith or more potions and items you can carry, things of that nature. So they are kind of categorized here, but both kind of boil down to being the same in terms of what they do deliver and offer. Unfortunately, these quests are another weak component overall of Final Fantasy's exploration loop. They are mostly fetch quests in many instances that do provide little to no real narrative input or anything that really does flesh out the story or provide meaningful rewards. With that being said, before I trigger people who say, yeah, but there are actually some good side quests here, I know there actually are some really good stories that are told through these side quests. And that's what adds salt to the wound, is that there are just some really good side quests here that do tell a good story, and then many other ones that are just very MMO-like in what they are. You know, grab 3 pieces of wood, go to a farm and collect grapes, or just, you know, go talk to a few different people around the city and collect a hammer or something. It's like a bunch of just useless quests. And then you get some quests that really pack a punch and just, you know, help further expand this world and how bleak the setting is for bearers, for example. Like one quest in particular, you were talking to this father outside of his house and he's like, go find my boy, I think he's in trouble. I heard a scream, and then you run over and you have a look and see that the boy has been feeding the bearer servants to the wolves for fun. And like, this is just like twisted in a way. And then the way that these characters and people respond to Clive are like, you know, it's crazy, and you just see this disparity between bearers and non-bearers and the outcomes of those stories. Granted that the impact you put on that quest as Clive does have its own limitations, it still does tell a meaningful story within that world and does paint a picture of Valisthea and the crisis it's going through. It's these types of quests that really do add substance to the overarching story and themes of this world and what is going on currently through the main story and what Clive is fighting for. It made me really feel something, but unfortunately these stories are so sparse, and it's a shame because, I mean, if we had half the quantity of total quests that were in this game, but of that quality and above, I would be a bit more satisfied with the side quests in this game. The other issue with these side quests, along with the repetitive fetch quest nature, is the rewards. Again, I loop back to this because it is a big weak point for this game. Outside of some gil, which is money, XP, and renown points, there really isn't anything here that rewards you for completing these quests. And look, like in a lot of games, their side quests really don't give you anything too crazy, but here it is really like you don't feel rewarded for your time. And there rarely is ever really a substantial, useful reason to go and do these quests outside just the curiosity and wanting to just be a completionist. They may reward things like, you know, materials sometimes and things that, again, you use to craft better weapons, but I always look back to this. Why would you need that when, you know, your weapons are just stat increases? This whole area of progression and exploration and how they loop back into each other is such a huge weakness, and is the sword that I think Final Fantasy XVI dies on. For everything that it gets right, this area is just a big weak point and a big wound in what is otherwise a fantastic game. Personally, what is interesting to me, the more I observe and reflect on my experience with the game, and particularly this aspect of the game, is how side quests really could have uplifted and built on the foundations of this incredible world and this awesome narrative. I earlier discussed how the story will diverge and introduce side stories into the main story and kind of tack them on, and I feel like these would have been better suited to serve as a multi-part side quest for these different locations in Valisthea that could further build it out and its world and characters. On top of having those particular quests and memorable characters tied to locations, but we could also see a similar type of side quest system applied to many of the main cast in this story and the pseudo party members that frequent Clive's life. And I do feel that these characters are pretty likable and, you know, do bring things to the table here in the story, but I feel like if you had given them at least some form of side quest or something where you can really just tag along and get to know their story on a more intimate level, you would have been able to really connect with them a lot more and understand their ambitions and adversities. And I do think that you do get a level of that with a few characters here, but there are some that really just fall to the wayside, and I really do think that although we do get a look into one or two of them, I do think we could do a lot more. And overall, this is one aspect of Final Fantasy XVI that I think they held back on, and this is one thing that holds it back from that overall greatness, is just how much of an overcorrection this game took when approaching the RPG elements of the game. The linear corridor levels that feel like Final Fantasy XIII, the fetch quests that feel like something out of Final Fantasy XIV, and at times the overall weak progression system that doesn't provide any really useful or memorable upgrades outside of minor damage and defense boosts. It is a shame, but this side of the experience really sours an overall stellar experience, and had this area of the game actually landed and popped off, I do think that Final Fantasy XVI would be an easy contender for Game of the Year. Okay, so to close out this whole section where I'm talking about the gameplay, I want to talk about one interesting aspect that I think is important for this game, and that is replayability. So the replay value for many other contemporaries like Devil May Cry is the post-game. Once you've completed the campaign, it is to replay the game on a harder difficulty. Seeing as Final Fantasy XVI is a more action game than an RPG, that would leave me to question how much does the New Game Plus offer and how deep do these combat systems go in terms of mastery opposed to their other hack and slash oriented contemporaries. I feel like people's mileage may vary here, but I do think that it is a point of worthy mention, as previous Final Fantasy games would often fall on much of their RPG elements and mini-games to lengthen the player's runtime. This could be through fully completing the sphere grid, mastering materia, breeding chocobos, triple triad, or other mini-games, farming and completing limit break quests as well, completing side quests and many different weapons and getting the ultimate weapon, fighting hidden bosses, all of these things. Like, there is no ruby weapon or emerald weapon equivalent in Final Fantasy XVI. There is no mini games like triple triad. There's no chocobo breeding. There's nothing like that here that really does flesh out those RPG elements or even provide really mini games. There is just side quests and hunts. And I think that would be fine if the core focus of this game was to amp it up and provide the depth through its mechanics and go through different difficulties and jump up and up and up, sort of like DMC, but there's only really one new difficulty, and that seems to introduce more on the RPG side of things with new levels, you know, an ultimate weapon to get, which is a nice added bonus, but how much is there really to do once you finish this game once? And I feel like once you complete it, is there ever really a reason to go back and play it again outside of its story? I'll look back at Final Fantasy XVI the similar way that I look back on a game like Fallout 4, which I played back in 2015. I remember playing that game back in the day and being like, wow, this game is incredible, and I really liked it. I went full completionist on it and did everything, and I enjoyed it. But then after playing it the first time around, I never felt that urge to want to go back and really revisit the game. It's not like I didn't like it, it's not even a matter of liking it. I still think it was a good game, but it didn't have that sense of replayability that the previous Fallout games did. And here with Final Fantasy, although I know that Fallout and Final Fantasy are very different games, they're both kind of like RPGs, albeit very different ones. I do feel like with Final Fantasy XVI, I question whether or not I would want to go back and play it in a year or two from now, or the one playthrough that I've had now and my enjoyment with it is like all I really need, and you know, it'll just be something that's on my shelf. I'm really hoping that I am wrong here and that I will want to go back to it and play it in the future, but having experienced it now, I don't really feel compelled to want to go back and play it. It's a good game and it has a lot of fun and a lot of good story moments and a lot of good characters and a lot of depth there that I really liked, and the combat itself was good, it was competent and it was fun, but I just wonder how long it would take before I'd want to jump back into it. Obviously, we're still around the release of this game, so they could add various modes and difficulties that ramp up things for hardcore fans. They could even add stuff to, you know, cater to the RPG side of the game. Only time will really tell, and I do wonder though, and this is the big takeaway and the biggest concern or thing that I would want you to think about with this game is, I wonder how favorably time will look back on Final Fantasy XVI. Because at release, everything has been fairly glowing for this game, and I understand why. Overall, it is a pretty great game, but it isn't without its flaws, and I just wonder, in the span of time and when looking back, how will this game age for better or worse? If there's one aspect of Final Fantasy that everyone can agree on that this game absolutely nails, it is the sheer amount of spectacle and visual eye candy that is packed into this game, along with its beautiful vistas and locales. This coupled with an incredible soundtrack that hits all the right notes at all the right times. Like, there was this one particular fight where the music just kicked in alongside the visual spectacle and what the game was having me do, and it was incredible. It was just some balls to the wall craziness that I'd expect to see in something like Metal Gear Rising more than Final Fantasy. And the crazier thing coupled with that is just how well this actually worked for me. Like, each sequential fight and fight segment that takes place, particularly the Eikon ones, are just more and more intense and go harder and crazier each time, and it works in so many different ways. These performances from many of the different actors here are incredible as well, particularly Ben Starr as Clive. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of this game will ride on how much you click with Clive. Thankfully, I think Ben Starr does a really good job at making Clive such a likable character, really honing in on a lot of the different themes and feelings throughout many of these different scenes and creating such a relatable and likable character that you can really easily click with. And I think even in combat, you know, the subtle F-bombs when your health gets low and things like this, there's just these little flourishes that he does so well with this character and really makes that experience as, you know, Clive is the central character here, and that focus less on a party and more around one particular character really would mean that you'd need to like that main character, and I think he does an excellent job at making Clive so likable. I think Ralph Inson as Sid and Susanna Fielding as Jill are also some incredible standouts, but I've only mentioned a few here, but overall I think that the whole cast here did an incredible job at landing a lot of the performances with a lot of these different characters. And I feel like even little side characters that you just meet on the street or, you know, see here and there in those towns, like, they have very good vocal performances here. And I think overall that's just a testament to how much and how endearing a lot of these towns and things are, and I think the visual and audio presentation really just works for this game and sells a lot of it. And when I speak about visuals, the towns and cities themselves are so incredible, and there's so much flair and so many aspects to these different areas that just comes to life and really builds that aspect of the Final Fantasy universe that we're used to. So, many people have discussed this, and I'll touch on this too. People will say that Final Fantasy XVI has taken a lot of influence from works such as Game of Thrones, and whilst I think some of that can be true with the more darker tone, political intrigue and backstabbing, I do think that in a lot of different ways, Final Fantasy is still telling its own unique story, especially in its visual and world presentation here. If you look at this, I would say this is very much a Final Fantasy game, and that's what I'm getting at here. The world itself, different locations and major cities and empires here, the big sprawling crystals that inhabit many of these different cities, the things such as chocobos and moogles and things that are pretty pivotal to the Final Fantasy experience are all here. So whilst I would say that Final Fantasy XVI has taken influences from a lot more Western fantasy stories, I would say that in many ways a lot of the DNA that encompasses a Final Fantasy game is still here intact. And it's not just through the narrative itself, but how they build many of these different cities and empires and then provide the necessary lore to kind of flesh many of these different places out. And I'm all for it, and I think it is incredible, and honestly one of the big high points of Final Fantasy XVI. Okay, bringing this all together, I enjoyed Final Fantasy XVI. A lot actually. It had a thrilling narrative that kept me engaged, and Clive's journey is one that will stick with me. The new action-based combat systems make for a great new take on the Final Fantasy experience and provide a fun playthrough, albeit the first time around. Whilst I enjoyed this combat model, I do wonder how enjoyable and expansive it can be throughout multiple playthroughs, and how long it can take till this game starts to weigh on you, and how long it can remain fresh and engaging to interact with. The Eikon Battles here are a true spectacle and visual feat for video games and the series. Honestly, this is something that will stick with me for a long time, and I do think that this sheer level of visual presentation here is unrivaled by many other games. I think that this is where Final Fantasy XVI really shines, and I think that there is so many things that it gets right, and the Eikon Battles are truly a testament to this game, and it will be one thing that everyone looks back fondly on who has experienced this game. However, the flip side to this high-octane action and gripping narrative is a progression and exploration model that feels quite stale and outdated. It feels like it was built for a 10-hour game but is being stretched across a 40-hour game. The different swords and armor that you acquire could be removed in favor of stat buffs when you level up, and you would not be able to tell the difference. It truly is a shame, and I do feel that some people may feel divided on this and feel like they think this game does that aspect well, but I would say, in my eyes, that Final Fantasy XVI is a great game, but it is certainly not an RPG or a well-made RPG. Overall, I do believe that Final Fantasy XVI is a game that is worth your time and a game worth experiencing. It has a fantastic narrative that'll pull you all the way through and keep you engaged, with an adrenaline-pumping action sequences and these Eikon Battles, man. I can't stress enough just how crazy they are. However, for as much enthusiasm as I have for those aspects of the game, I can't help but feel slightly bummed at the stale to non-existent progression models and exploration that feels lifeless and hollow. Valisthea is such an incredible world with such incredible locations, and I just feel had this aspect of the game been fleshed out and done a bit more justice, this game actually would have just been top tier. So if you're on the fence about this one, I would suggest downloading the demo and trying it out, because the demo does provide a good appetizer as to what the full game of Final Fantasy does provide, and I think that overall, Final Fantasy XVI is a great game. A flawed game, yes, but a good game, and I think that despite many of its issues that I have with it, I will remember this game fondly, and I can say that I had a fun experience with it. But as it stands, for me, Final Fantasy XVI is a flawed RPG, but a great game, and one that I really recommend you at least check out, at least give the demo a try and see if you like it, because there is much fun to be had here. For all the flaws that I've listed that I've had with the RPG elements, it wasn't enough to weigh this down and say that I didn't like it. There was a lot here that I really did enjoy with this game, and if I'm railing hard on it, it's because there was so much. This could have just been like so much more. There was so much in those RPG elements that could have just uplifted this way more to like greatness. And whilst this game is great, it could have just pushed the envelope a little bit more. But overall, I enjoyed Final Fantasy XVI, and I think it is definitely worth your time and checking out. And if you like this review and you've made it this far, maybe consider hitting the like or subscribe button if you have the time, and I greatly appreciate you watching this video. I know it's been a long one. Hope you have a good day, and thanks for watching.